Well, everybody knows the Zimbabwean voice now, so that's for sure. And it's a beautiful voice, that one. One of unity, one of togetherness, one of peace, one of love, you know. That's the way forward. Oga, Oga.
Ropa, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and share your story. How are you doing today, and how's everything good?
Well, thank you for having me and believing I have a story that's important to share on your platform. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm good. Everyone has a story that's important to share. That at least that's my belief. But the main reason why I wanted to, I'm doing well, thank you. The reason I wanted to speak to you, I think, as you spoke offline prior to this, was, I think, two main things. I think the first thing, of course, is there are many people like you and myself who are able to, of course, we go overseas, we're both Zimbabweans born and raised, but we go overseas, we get these degrees and so on and so forth. But eventually, like, if you're fortunate enough, there are family businesses or so that helped us get these degrees abroad. And so we should speak about succession and what it looks like to even manage these assets, and of course, the transition between being foreign and then, of course, coming back to Zim, if that's something that people want to entertain. I think you have a lot of perspective on that piece. And then the second piece, I know you've been heavily involved in the creative community, especially art and Zimbabwean artists. And I want to just touch on those two things, but I think you have some valuable insight there. So to start off with, who is Ropa? Where does she work right now at this time?
Sure. So my name is Ropafadzo Sibusiso Chidawu. I'm currently the Group MD and CEO of Gombe Holdings, which is a real estate and infrastructure group that we were currently undertaking quite extensive debt restructuring. And we have companies that are within our construction and insurance and a range of real estate assets. I think it can be categorized as something that was started as a family enterprise in a certain way. However, I don't think that's an entirely accurate label, is to say, look, there was a level of sort of maybe a quasi-family office structure and concept. But we've had listed entities within our group, Bank ABC, Pelams, and quite a lot of regulated insurance companies. That mean that you're dealing with different shareholders and quite extensive regulatory frameworks, which is another complicating factor. By way of my sort of academic background, I studied law at King's College London, and I have a master's in economic history from the LSE. I came back to Zim in 2013, and I practiced law at Scanlon and Holderness. And after that, I joined Premix Concrete, which is our concrete business. And I joined I was brought back to Zim, for a gap year. I came back saying, look, my late father at the time had said to me, my goal had been to say, I wasn't sure I wanted to practice law anywhere in the world. I'd found my law degree quite heavy at King's, and I found it very difficult. So I wasn't sure I wanted to continue, but I wasn't clear what I wanted to do next. I had no clue. And so the idea I had was I was going to do a PhD in history in the States. I'd been very scared. Well, my dad says to me, no, you can't. He really still wanted a lawyer at the time. So he says to me, come to Zim, qualify as a lawyer, because you're not going to understand how Zim works. One day I'm going to die, and you can't be someone who builds their whole career abroad. So it was a bit of a fight back, and I came in to practice law, qualified. And then when I joined sort of quote unquote the group, I joined at a particularly chaotic time. So it was at a time when you've got a 30-year enterprise that's quite large, has quite extensive assets, but had become highly leveraged. And had a lot of informal aspects to it. So it was a complex enterprise with too many informal habits, and you were sort of managing chaos. So I then joined whilst I was writing my GRE exams. And I think this is now like almost 9 years later, and I now lead the group, and I've held various different roles, but it was more to say, I'm even surprised, but it was more, it was a problem that I wanted to solve. I didn't have entrepreneurial ambitions or any sort of those kinds of ambitions, but I always looked at it from an academic problem to say, this is a big problem that I want to solve. And I think there was always that intellectual obsession to, and it was always to say, I think when I left uni, I had 3 values to say, I want to use my skills, which is I want to do complex work, but I want to use my intellect, which is creativity. So creativity being someone who comes from a classical music background. And I want to use my heart, which is to say, I want to do work that's impactful. So obviously at the time, that felt like the most impactful work, though it was the most stressful work you could find personally, professionally. It was stressful and is stressful on both fronts.
Thank you so much for all that. Do you have siblings?
Yes, I do have siblings. So in terms of my immediate family, I'm the youngest of 3. I have my older sister who's based in the US. And then I have my brother, my late brother, my older brother, he passed on in 2017. And I think at the time, the deal had been all 3 siblings had my late father believed you should have a knack to try and be involved in the business. And I think by the time my brother died, I was feeling burnt out, and I now wanted to go to business school in the US. But we'd always had a deal to say at least one person should be in the country to keep order and sanity. Unfortunately, as I was doing my exams, my brother came back to Zim and he passed on 6 weeks 6 weeks later. And then beyond that, as of 6 months ago, when my dad passed, I also have 4 younger half siblings.
Yeah, I mean, my condolences, of course, to your father and your brother. I know I never got a chance to meet Isha, but I remember the time when he passed away, and I remember that being really sad through, family, friends. It almost feels like, I don't know if it was placed on you in a way, but it kind of fate decided that you had to be the person to lead. Do you feel that way?
Yeah, and I always say I'm an unlikely successor. In the sense that, look, Ishe was a guy, I'm the youngest, unmarried, I'm an academic person. I like class. I didn't necessarily grow up being like, I want to be a business person. I'd never seen it as a worthwhile pursuit, if I'm honest. But I think when my brother died, and my brother had been poorly, and the stress and of all of it had really taken a toll. But I could see my dad at the time used to cry himself to sleep, and he was really personally affected. And so you almost got the sense that there's no one left to be responsible, and I didn't feel comfortable just getting on the next flight, not unlike the rest of my family, which live in the US. It wasn't an option for me. So at the time, I would say it was always personal conviction to say, look, it was more my heart, just not sure that, there's no one left. And if everyone drops dead, what's next, right? That was how I was looking at it. And that's an irony to say 5 years later, you're sort of last woman standing in a lot of instances, but definitely unplanned. It was always to solve a problem, and with the goal to say, if you solve a problem, you can have long-term impact, and just not wanting to be a Black stereotype. Maybe that conviction was always stronger than the aversions I have to these types of role. But definitely my brother passing on meant that your de facto success in terms of concept, African way, is gone. So there's no one left. And I think I would have never led I was always competent, but I think, even my late dad would have said, I would have wanted your brother to lead this business, and I would have wanted that. But he himself says, look, I also have to know that I've educated my kids and we're going to go for meritocracy. Now, it's always push and pull because there's always other dynamics at play. But that was essentially it. I think it meant that, and also I think at the time of that stage of grief, I didn't want to ever leave because I felt I would leave my brother on who's buried at our farm. And I don't know, I had a very sentimental attachment to Zim after that, to say, if I go, there's like, what's next? So it's been to say, yeah, I guess so. I definitely unplanned, but maybe sometimes I think that's my advantage, that I didn't look for it, but I want to solve a problem, and I want to do so.
Yeah, it's completely fair. What I struggle to like wrap my head around is this idea of course, Zimbabwe is an interesting environment where a lot of people who are able to, of course, go overseas, or at least just live well, often have a background in entrepreneurship, whether that's through, family owning particular assets. And of course, how wealth is passed on, of course, it's meant to be passed on from generation to generation. That's normal. There's nothing abnormal about that.
It's normal in most places, but here it's taboo.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's an offensive concept in and of itself.
Why?
And yeah, and it's something I'm still grappling with. I think it's twofold, right? It's to say, I remember sometimes it's to say there's no framework for, okay, so say Dumi, you are the founder of X and you have your son. I think you may find it difficult, as much as you can mentor your son, teach them whatever you're doing, but also give them better educational opportunities than you had, for example. And it's all fun and games until perhaps they really become competent. And for succession to work, you have to be critiquing the respective business personally and professionally. So there's always this tension and push and pull. And so on one hand, I think in terms of, look, we just got independence late in 1980. So you're coming from a situation where we're genuinely one generation removed from poverty. So we're still in a situation where you're kind of, no one understands the different governance, ownership structures, the difference between owning something in your personal capacity and a trust. And no one in a situation where they understand that we follow papers, not our personal sentiment, in terms of an African tribunal. So I think part of it is to say the reason you don't have succession is because the personal attitudes are sometimes at odds with the professional convictions required to grow an enterprise, but to ensure it outlives its founders and it outlives the second generation, and that it becomes an enterprise that's more complex and that has a more meaningful, that's institutional. To get there, it's not just even, you'll have the context of your immediate family dynamics that you have to confront, but you also have uncles and all sorts who will be saying, oh, there's no men here, these girls will get married, blah, blah, blah. There's also that cultural aspect, which can be an inhibiting factor. And it's a very big inhibiting factor, being to say in the sectors we're in, whether it's construction or the concept of, dynasty, competent dynasty, not nepotism. Those two are different. And that succession taking place, those in and of itself, those can offend others who are saying, why should it take place? I think that's what I've seen, is that it's not even just, it's difficult because we've lived in circumstances in Zim where succession doesn't take place. You'll have a pastor who's led the church for 30 years. There's no succession in politics. It's completely unfamiliar to the detriment of the enterprise. Like usually you say, look, after X amount of time, I should have gotten to here and there should be another generation leading. It would be very different with how I would lead it, but that's because I have experience with succession now. So this is really a bit of colonial legacy, if you're really honest, to say, and it's colonial legacy, but it's also in the context of many, maybe on the Black side, it's confronting patriarchy, knowing how to disagree without being disagreeable. Any enterprise should have debate and robust debate on a professional level, but most of us should be able to then still shake hands after that on a personal. But I think that takes a lot of maturity that most people don't have.
It feels like a point at which two cultures are clashing. Of course, there's like the traditional, the traditional structures, of course, of seniority and of course respect for elders. But then of course, that's fine. But when it comes to operating this entity, there are things I have to say that people might not like, and I have to speak it as it is. That's on one part. But then of course, there's a seniority piece. So even though you might have been the head of said enterprise for X amount of years or what have you, that might not be the way in which you sustain it over a long period of time. So I think those tensions kind of coexist.
Not just that, Dumi. It's one thing where if you're looking to say it's about having robust market forces, right? You're saying, for example, what should be an objective metric is to say, say you are in the US, the UK, you judge a CEO's performance based on the share price, right? So we can say this thing, we're not happy, we move on and you go. In Zim, you've seen that whether it's a lot of the times to say whether it's listed, privately held, and everything in between. This issue of having leaders who, you know, it's in all of a sort of our private sector institutions. And I think it's in my view, it's a failure, you know, it's people being defined perhaps by their work in a way that makes it difficult to realize I'm building something that does not define me. Right? So I know lots of people who say, okay, I don't want to let go because I don't know what I'll do next afterwards. I don't have a plan, so I have to die in this position. That is a Zimbabwean culture. Whether you're dealing with a law firm, an accounting firm, whether you're leading, whatever you're dealing with, that is across the border. And to say you can end up in a situation where you look at young people coming into the enterprise as competition. So you end up with, I mean, to use my hands, it's where an organization should be like this, where you're training your recent graduates and they're climbing the ranks.
Right.
It actually ends up like this. Because the people who came in, they don't actually want to create new talent that could be coming with new ideas. And then they are also now costing the business significant amounts of money and are pricey to get rid of. So you now have these sort of enterprises that are now stuck in limbo. So it's never personal to say, it's always to say inherently you should have that model where young people are coming in with new ideas, new ways of looking at it, but they're being given adequate training in the enterprise. The reason most young people will fail is because they don't get enough exposure, because whoever's been assigned to supervise them doesn't want to train them because they're scared. If I train them, that's what
better than me. I'm gone.
Yeah.
I'm gone.
I'm gone. Yeah. You see, the reality is that people, you know, so you end up with this crisis to say that's why the succession concept becomes unfamiliar. And it's also to say in terms of sort of a push between Western and African, right? It's confusing because you're raised with both. For me, it's to say I was raised with a very progressive parent, right? Which is why in terms of educational opportunities, my brother and I got the exact same opportunity. There was just never a distinction at all. And so you say to some, and then you within don't realize that even if he has that position, the market is still unfamiliar with women in the workplace with technical skills who are saying, no, we're not just going to come sit here, take money out of the coffers and go shopping. We're saying we are here to. You're also dealing with unfamiliar dynasty, because there are a lot of those types of people who say, okay, I want to go on holiday, phone company X, get the money out and move on. You're saying, no. I understand that's not correct governance. And I'm going to, I think I worked Sunday to Sunday from about 2014 to 2017, I worked Sunday to Sunday, 9 to 9 most of the time.
Just grinding, just working back to back.
I just felt I had to, I felt that I had to earn my stripes. I felt I had to show my other colleagues that, look, yes, we may have a different background, but we are all largely Black people with when you see our white enterprises, some of them are dealing with 3 to 5 generations in. So I kind of wanted to show that just because you're a Black person with middle-class disposition, that you're not a brat and you can actually do work and you're going to be as good as anyone. And I think for me, what I didn't like was the stereotype that, you know, you don't go from strength to strength. You go from one Black successful person to the next person failing and the next one being even more of a failure. So I was overworking. I'm still a bit intense like that, but I've definitely relaxed a bit. But it was, but I felt that I remembered I would see all of my colleagues knocking off at 4 or 5, and I just liked being the last person to switch off the lights. And I sort of got exposure to enough work. So my point is, it's twofold. You also have a generation sometimes that are careless with their privilege, but you also have an older generation at times that also don't understand their privilege, in that perhaps they got roles at a time when there was the market was conducive, and that your whole premise is to say you want your next generation to be better than yourself. But that's not a personal indictment on your said self. So it's like to say, Dumi, we should be all able, I remember, to disagree. You say, I remember once my late dad would say, whether you have a pothole or not, it doesn't matter what political party you're in. It affects you as a Zimbabwean. So you have to get to a point where we can disagree and solve a problem without it's to solve the problem, but not to say, okay, but who created the problem? We need a solution. You know what I mean? So sometimes you would find yourself implementing a solution that's very straightforward, but it being seen as a critique on another manager and his little camp that who's saying, I've been here 25 years and that was never necessary. And it's, for example, in the context of real estate, is to say, okay, but if you have owner occupation of real estate assets, you're not generating any yields from them. So if we're saying that you have 10 offices, we're going to say, let's generate yield. Let's all move into an open plan. But at the time it was to say, you're not respecting someone why should they share and sit in an office with someone else? You know, there were those kinds of, they're cultural, but they are killing the business. So it's not personal. You kind of have expenses. You need to increase your top line. But you'd find yourself, and I would be so confused. What are you offended by?
These are facts. This is an objective.
These are facts, but that is, again, perhaps someone, I think a family friend to say, that's still a bit, maybe, a lot of maybe British disposition to say the facts shouldn't be a debate, right? And why can't we just run by the facts are not what we're debating. So I'm always saying we don't debate facts, right? Right? And then we can propose solution based on the facts at hand. Full stop. But so that formality you're bringing in, that someone will be offended by the facts because they're saying, the facts indicate that, without anyone having to tell me that there's maybe my office is going, and, you know, I'm not sure if I answered your question correctly, but
no, you did.
It's a difficult one.
So I guess the thing I kept thinking as you were speaking was, has it been worth it? That's always the big thing, because of course, not that everyone has a choice. We all have choices, right, in this life to say yay or nay. Has it been a worthwhile exercise? And do you think this is something that will be useful for you and your? I mean, of course it'll be useful, but has it been worth it? Let me just keep it there. Has it been worth it?
Sometimes you have to answer me, depends on the day. Sometimes I don't always have sometimes it's an absolute in the heat of it. I'll say, look, I'm distinguishing between the personal and the professional. On a before
I let you finish, because people are listening who are in your shoes, right? People will be in your shoes who say, this problem, I see it there. I have friends who call me, they say, Chief, my parents are getting older.
Yeah.
My parents are getting older. And there's that thing that's over there. I don't know how it works.
And it's quite scary to not know what you are doing. And look, so I can answer that. I'm going to answer it in 2 ways. I'm going to answer it personally and professionally, right? So if I'm answering personally, overall, I would say yes, because I think if I remember when my brother died and he died in his bedroom, I was there, I saw it happen. Now, if I had been in Zim, so if I had been in the UK, I think I would have been tormented to say I didn't really, you're always hearing secondhand information, right? And in more recent terms is to say, my dad passed away recently. So the last decade, I got to spend a lot of time with both, so in that context, yes, it's been worth it. But also, in so doing, it's also been personally taxing because at times you're dealing with complex legacy that, and you are confused to say, yeah, but my contribution here should be obvious. Why am I not getting a crown? I've done so much work. I've taken salary cuts. I'm competent, guys. Why am I now still dealing with people or third parties who want to relate to the enterprise in a manner that's informal, unprofessional, and I'm still at it? So those days I feel like, no, but overall, yes. Now, if I'm answering you professionally, the answer is, it's also still a nuanced answer. On the no, is to say, the reality is to say you join a law firm in Zimbabwe, for example, that is a significant salary cut from what your peers are earning in London.
Yep.
So, and then you join a concrete plant. And if you are a responsible individual, you've taken yet another salary cut. Right? So you've taken cut after cut after cut. Yeah. And then you are presuming that people are going to understand that my contribution to this enterprise is I'm sacrificing this as a responsible fiduciary. I'm either going to get that money paid back to me, or it's my debt is going to be converted to equity, you name it. But that is a factual, not a personal conviction, right? So where you get nervous is to say, look, I'm hoping that's what it will translate, and I will be able to have an exit that is maybe not an exit, but to say, at least I'll be able to recoup the lost earnings somehow, some way, but not immediately, maybe in a decade, right? That's where you're saying, is it worth it? You're saying, no, you've taken a risk, and I would be saying, I still don't know if my risk will work or not, right? That's the fact. It depends on, that time. Now, if I'm talking about other aspects of professionalism, yeah, absolutely. Because I think I remember I had a friend of mine who said to me, Ropa, I know you're struggling. I know this is difficult. And what's more difficult is people not knowing how difficult it is. It looks, I think from a distance, it can look like it's glamorous, right? Yeah, right. It's really taxing. And she said, think of it, if you were in London at a law firm or wherever, you'd just be, you spend your days fiddling around with Excel sheets, and you would know that you are someone who cares about that. You have, at least now the stakes are so high that you're actually being able to have impact, and that that you're a decision maker. And I've become a leader in so doing, right? So there's no, but also it's going back to sort of your intellectual curiosity to say, I'm also solving problems in a very creative way. Is there a possibility that I would have been able to incorporate my interest in art into solving a business problem? So that's a personal passion, perhaps, but it's very much part of a solution to a business problem as well. So on a professional level, is to say you get so much exposure that at a younger age that I wouldn't have gotten elsewhere. And then the responsibility for me is to say, with that exposure, try and create opportunities for other young people. So I'm able to introduce graduate training programs, which I feel very strongly about, where we're actually training, not looking at young people who are coming from university as competition, right? So there's in those, we've had like maybe 10 to 12 graduate trainees. Some are with us, some have gone on to do postgrads abroad. They very much have a sensible foundation of a career in Zim. So yeah, yes and no, right? Yes. So yes, but on the no side is to say, it's a bit of I think I don't like to answer in sort of binary terms. So I think I've answered your question to say it is both, sometimes depending on the day.
Yes. I think that's probably the best answer, because sometimes there are no absolutes, right? There's a spectrum that fluctuates from, from whatever's going on at that particular moment. I like to always go back to how a person grew up, where I think a lot of the time it informs the person that they are today. How did you have a happy childhood? What did you want to be when you were growing up?
Okay, happy childhood. It's an interesting question. You always, I think childhoods are best discussed with therapists, right? So I'm not in that kind of questions like that, unless I'm in a therapy section.
Cool.
But in terms of my childhood, so I went to Highlands Primary School, which was a government school in Highlands, and so did my siblings. And at the time, that's how I learned to play the violin. I met a girl who had been playing the violin from when she was 4 and could read music. And, classical music helps with your math skills and reading and stuff like that. And I remember her saying, I thought she was lying that she could play the violin and read music until she actually played and showed me doing it. So I went home and cried to my dad, begging to say, listen, I can't be left behind like this. So I started playing the violin when I was about 6 or 7. And because my older siblings were 5 and 7 years, they'd gone to boarding school in England, and I mean, not in England, but in Peterhouse. And I was now at home by myself. So I asked if I could be transferred to Springvale, which was a boarding school in Maronda. Now, it was interesting because that was when I really first experienced racism. When I was at Highlands, and at the time, Highlands was a much better school than Springvale. I'm stating that to say, it's this thing to say, these government schools were competitive, and you hope that they become competitive again. When I got to Springvale, there was no orchestra. There was the kids, they couldn't read music. I was completely mortified that this was the case. But then you are now dealing with, maybe for my first experience of racism, and I was at school during those land reform eras, and I went to Peterhouse until Form 4. And I didn't quite like the quality of education I was receiving at the time, because I'd done my O-levels and the like, but I felt that, not being fully aware, but I felt that maybe there was no Zimbabwean anything to those schools. You couldn't speak Shona at the school. There were all these sort of racist undertones to them. So at the time, I wanted to go back to school in town, though my preference was to be a boarder. But anyway, I say to my dad, I want to do this IB program, not thinking he was going to say no. Then he says to me, oh, no, if you want to do IB, you must do it. You must do it in a boarding school. But there's no boarding school in Zim. It was either maybe HIS. So at the time, he then, I think, Alison McGrath, she sends her daughter, who was at a boarding school in England, and to say to me, hey, you're actually good at this classical music stuff. You would be, a boarding school in England would be a good fit. And so at the time, I was trying to get into a school called Seven Oaks. I didn't get in. I ended up at a school in the West Midlands called Malvern College, where they were teaching IB. And I go there, and it's the way they teach it, brilliant, it's really, IB program is great for me because I love science. I love creative stuff. I'm combining everything. So I'm someone who enjoyed math and chemistry as much as I did history, English, and all of the above. So I felt it wasn't putting me in a box in the way an A-level would. But it was now a time when you are now experiencing very unique racism, sort of class racism, right? So sort of these spaces where they genuinely had not had Black people. I mean, it was another level of exclusion to say a private school in Zimbabwe. So I got there. So I got there at a time.
It's like bomber jackets. It's a whole like aesthetic. It's a different thing. But so I was confused by the time I got there, and it was but it was a very good experience, because at the time I sort of became a bit more worldly, because I remember the teacher talking about Idi Amin and looking at me, and I'm completely clueless. I've heard my dad say who Idi Amin is, but I'm also not Ugandan. I have no clue what they're talking about, or them being surprised that I could play, that I was supposed to be in the orchestra. Them being surprised that I knew how to play hockey. Them being, there were now a lot of stereotypes of what Blacks can do and can't do. And I felt a lot of
And I think so that's where sort of I started. But what I liked about that school was to say, where you would say, listen, can I have some books to read? So you guys are asking me all these Africa questions. I don't know any, like none of this curriculum. They would then order the books for you, and you become, empowered and the like. So I was that's a bit of my childhood. It was largely a childhood which was premised on, again, being a bit intense, just wanting, I was always, the violin, you have to practice a lot, right? So when I was at Peterhouse, I was violining, saxophoning, and pianing, and all of that. So I was also a very intense, busy kid. A lot of that schedule, I still kind of stick to it I've been doing it from when I was very young, sort of in your free time, practice your violin or read a book. And so I was very intense. And I've still stuck to that, and that's why I like being back in Zim, is to say, yes, I've had a privileged upbringing, but that privileged upbringing means I should give this a shot and try, because if not me, what about a young Black person coming from the rural area? They're not they have not a fighting chance. So if I'm scared and intimidated, which is for good reasons, fair enough. And it's not, I can assure you, it's not a bed of roses, and it is taxing in every way possible. But I think if you've had privilege of opportunities that many Black Zimbabweans have not had, I would hope that you try, and that's a personal conviction for me, not for everyone, but that's a part of when I say, when I'm having a bad days, at least I'm aware that many people do not have the educational opportunities I've had. And I hope to be a good steward of those by creating opportunities where I can, and being a responsible business leader.
So poignant. I remember when I was doing my research, I read I think a piece, of course, around why you got into law, and you said you want to tell us a story about you were in a meeting, and then there was like a powerful businesswoman that you heard speaking. Then you said, I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to do that. What was that? Who was that woman? What was that story?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one, and I knew you would be interested in it. And it's sad because, so I grew up, my dad was in construction sector, and he used to take us to his sites on holidays. So I grew up very familiar, to say, in a construction business, you have your engineers, your quantity surveyors, you have your architects and the like. So at the time, the job that appealed to me was being an architect, because architecture, I could see it's math, science, but there's art, and there's a historical awareness that you can bring into the job. So that's really what appeals to me. And so I had wanted to be an architect, but at the time, obviously, even if you're going to these construction sites, I'd never seen a woman when I was growing up, but even now it's still the same. I'd never seen a female engineer, rarely saw a female architect. So this didn't seem, as much as my dad was saying, yeah, you can do it. But I didn't really know how to go about it. And that's very unfortunate, being that I had more exposure than most, right? And then I remember I was at the Munazi's house, and Florence Zumbe, this is just after George Bush invaded Iraq. And I remember her walking in, and she was very mad, and she was livid, and she was denouncing the invasion as unlawful. And she had all the men in the room listening to her. And she was so confident, line by line, and just saying why this is unlawful and the like. And I said, I think I asked someone, I said, who's that lady? What's her name? And someone said to me, her name is Florence Zumbe. She's a lawyer. And then I decided from that day, I'm changing gears, not because I knew I could draw a distinction between law and architecture, but just because I wanted to be taken seriously. So I presumed that this lawyer business is what's going to allow me to express opinions, to walk into a room and be taken seriously, which is fair enough, perhaps true, but that's not really what a career in law looks like per se. But still, it was just really, I was more thinking, what's the type of woman I want to become? And that at the time was Florence Zumbe.
I'm getting goosebumps, by the way, as you say that, because my sister is now a tax attorney, or she's a tax lawyer in Amsterdam, and she similarly, during holidays, will go and work at Florence Zumbe's law firm, just to be around the energy, just to be around and seep off. So that's part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation. Of course, all of the stories that I have is so that people can hear and see and maybe touch and be like, oh, okay, there's that thing that Ropa does, or how Ropa even speaks or articulates. I want to be able to do that with Ropa. What's her story and how did she come into being? So thank you so much for sharing that.
And even just to add to that, I was coming from a church called Assemblies of God, very, we're coming from a church where there were no female pastors. This was a church where women had to cover their heads, where women weren't allowed to speak or hold any leadership positions. So I didn't, when you're going to church every Sunday and you're not really seeing women in power, the reason she stood out to me was because of that. I didn't know, I hadn't grown up with women in being able to speak on those issues per se.
And I mean, clearly her legacy is still rubbed off, because now, of course, you can do all of those things and more, right?
Yeah.
I have a question around I feel like there's Ropa, the professional, but then also, of course, no one is a monolith. Of course, there's also like Ropa, I feel like there's Ropa, the artist as well, that coexist at the same time. I know, of course, you're very passionate about the arts and creative industry. Of course, there's a violin part, but maybe talk to us about how your journey with art began and how it has evolved over the years.
Yeah. So my journey with art, I would say it started with classical music, right? So classical music, it's an art form, but it's a disciplined one. It's one with very clear parameters that one must follow. It's one way. I never was one of those people who associated creativity with just sort of being free-spirited and all over the place, right? I associated creativity with discipline. So in terms of, say, contemporary art and going to, and how my journey with that form of art has evolved, I was interested, and when I was in the UK or whenever I could travel, I'd walk into galleries, museums, you name it. But I genuinely didn't know that beyond being a consumer, how does one deepen their relationship with art? And I remember when I was in uni, I think I was just, I picked up a Tatler magazine, and I saw Matetsi at the time had just launched, and they'd commissioned 16 works by Helen Teed. Now I said, why are they putting Helen Teed? And this is sort of a boutique hotel. And I then heard of the name. That Helen Teed is represented by First Floor Gallery, which is a Zimbabwean-based gallery. So I was very, obviously you go on Google and you try to figure out, but you can't figure it out. So fast forward to when I'm living in Zim, where I go to an exhibition here and there, but definitely in line with the history of exclusion that the art space operates in globally or world over or for centuries. There's no way I would have known that there's a space for art in terms of being an art collector, or that art can be part of, say, a real estate strategy, financial services, or that art has much more value beyond it being sort of a aesthetic pleasure and a historical tool. So what happened is, when we was trying to figure out how do you increase the yields of residential real estate and the like. And so a friend of mine from Malvern College, actually, she comes to Zim, and I said, what are you here for? She says, oh, Ropa, I've started collecting. And I said, collecting what? And she said, I'm an art collector. And I said, how are you doing this from Zim? And she says, she says, and I say, I'm completely confused as to what she's talking about. But she says to me, I think you need to get in touch with Valerie Kabov. And I said, are you sure? And I said, yeah. So at the time, I meet with Valerie Kabov, who's the co-founder of First Floor Gallery, and Laura Dreyer, who's also the co-founder of Artemisia, which is sort of art advisory in education. We have this long chat in what's an empty house. And I'm saying initially, I'm trying to say, okay, what Matetsi did, can I do something similar here? And can art sort of bring in a new audience into say what we're hoping will be a villa that houses a private art collection? And so they were very, very supportive of that idea. And and gave us very preferential terms to acquire our first two pieces, which is one by Helen Teed and Amanda Mushate. And after that, they said the First Floor Gallery then invited me to Investec. Now, when they did that, and I think that allowed me to see the business case for art, to see how art can be incorporated into an urbanization strategy. So seeing all those galleries at the waterfront on one hand, and to see how art brings in foot traffic, and it can be, from a policy perspective, it can actually be conducive to sort of growing your city. But beyond that, I went to a private collector's home, and there was a badge that said private art collector. So I get the badge and I said, oh, well, I'm that. And then so I sort of go with it, and then I'm completely confused. And so I said, okay, guys, so I'm an art collector.
I'm doing this. This is me.
And so I say, look, you're not going to give me that badge and I wanted to do honor to it, to say, okay, but how does this work in terms of why are financial services and companies in South Africa, banking and insurance entities in Nigeria, what is it about art, and how does art form part of a portfolio? I think the main thing we ended up getting to is I bought lots of books and started reading to say, how would we do justice to using art to add to diversifying our real estate portfolio, right? And for us, that was to say, in a context where there's inflation, where Zimbabwean art is, renowned on the international market, but you don't have a local collecting community, and you don't have the other parts of the supply chain functioning well. So the supply chain, in my view, is an artist, an art gallery, and a collector. So the gallery is sort of involved in the long-term business, the business of art, and ensuring that the artist has a sustainable career where they have visibility, and that they can actually, increase the value of that art. And the collector, our view is to say the collector is sort of trying to sort of make acquisitions that are conducive to say the sort of the creative economy, and it being structured and it being more stable. But also, if you're looking at it, I think I started reading on, say, the British Rail Pension Fund. And I think at the time, this was in the sort of 70s, when during an inflationary period in the UK, and where they put 3% of their assets into art, and they got quite exponential results, as in the long term, right? So we were saying in Zimbabwe, yes, we've got inflation, but inflation is not a global issue. How are we going to use art to incorporate it into our real estate projects, to give real estate assets a measure of diversification? If that makes sense. So it was to say that was a critical part. Then it was also to say, how can you, from an insurance perspective, looking at what have pension funds elsewhere done to, how have they played into the art, into acquiring art to preserve the value of policyholders and the like. So it's still a space where we're new, we're learning, and we're trying to do projects that incorporate that. But those are the questions we're asking ourselves, and we're trying to propose solutions in. So it's to say it's a full circle moment that art is part of the business, but me being very much someone who was creative, but who was also very disciplined. So I was always reluctant to say you're creative, because I thought that I didn't like the style of creativity, meaning that you don't keep working hours, and that you're just in the clouds, and sometimes you don't work for 6 months because you're going through or something. I didn't like that, but that was because I'm coming from a classical music training, right? So to answer your point is to say this type of work allows me to sort of do work that balances creativity with structured thinking, and sort of with a lot of your usual sort of math. It's holistic. That's what I think I enjoy about it.
Completely. I know. I mean, it's so powerful, because when I know I've invited to that, we've been talking over the past year or so, and I spoke to you about how when I was in Johannesburg, I actually worked for a development company and their core was rooted in art first. Art was the first thing, and it was like, if you've been to downtown Johannesburg, is pretty sketchy. If you're on, it's pretty sketchy, and there's a lot of crime, a lot of issues. But you art in the middle of those buildings. Oprah will fly there. Jay-Z will have his birthday there, and this stuff was happening when I was living there. It was crazy. Like, you'd have people, and not just locals, but people from across the world flying in to see Nelson Makamo galleries in the middle of downtown Joburg. So what happens is that art, of course, attracts people, as we discussed. People buy things in a particular area, and then the more people that are coming in buying things, the more you can charge for rent and so on and so forth. And then the assets, of course, start to yield.
But you know, Dumi, I just have to say thank you for that. When we were talking, when I was trying to say, no, guys, the art is part of the real estate solution. It's not just some sort of fringe passion project. I was struggling to, and I remember I remember right after you told me, look, I work for a real estate company. They have an art first, everything second. And I remember citing you verbatim when I was fighting to say that, because in the context you're talking about Maboneng, or I think we went to FMB Art Fair last year. It was amazing to see how incorporating art as part of real estate solution can contribute towards, you know, sometimes what are perceived to be unloved parts of your city, right? So this is a part of, you know, sort of when you're going to Bram and all of those areas, it was just so inspiring to see on that level to say, look, art is not just about exclusive neighborhoods and the like and so forth. Art is firstly, there's the value of art in terms of real estate assets, yes, and that's part of it's helping you urbanize and bring jobs to that section of the city. But there's also a part of it when you're talking to me on the hard side, is to say, how am I saying when we're trying to figure out how we're going to build our collection? I'm looking at it in 3 metrics to say, you also have a bit of power to say, okay, what story is important to tell, right? So say if I'm choosing a piece of art, I'm looking at it to say who's the artist, but who's representing them, importantly, because I'm trying to be part of a formal supply chain. So I want to know that, as opposed to, I think when we were talking, you were saying, why does artists end up selling by the side of the road and things like that? Say, look, am I part of ensuring that it's structured and that they are participating in what is a massive global, art is a huge part of, it's part of a larger global economy where Black women, all sorts of people have been excluded. And then if I'm saying, okay, the gallery, okay, what is their business strategy? Are they women involved? Are they people of color involved? I'm looking, and then it's another thing to say also personal history. So even just saying the Helen Teed we acquired, it said, wow, I can't believe 10 years later, something I saw in Tatler, the most Lani, aristocratic, not for people like us kind of magazine. I can't believe that it's now part of my project. And it's also to say that's where the sort of restitution component comes in. You shouldn't have to learn about art only when you go to London and all these fancy galleries and the like and so forth. They sort of have centuries of understanding how art plays into generational wealth and how art is important to hedge inflation, to increase your value of your yields and all of that. And we're excluded, but it seemed very fringe when I was trying to articulate it. And it's still something that a lot of the platforms we're creating, whether with our project, we respond to every Instagram, the WhatsApp group we are responding to each and every single question to encourage people to say, guys, this is also for us. It's another means of which we've been excluded. In the same way to say banking was never for us, or whatever the case is. This is just another means, and of which historically colonialism and all these things, slavery, have meant that we don't have enough information. Even if you have money, you're not inheriting an art collection that's been passed down by 600 years, to get my point. So we're starting late, and part of it is to say, look, how are we, it's personal and professional for me, because I also understand the business element of it and how it plays into wealth management strategies for a lot of for those who've had power, and me incorporating it our strategy. But it's also the personal side is trying to make the information accessible and for everyone to know that they can have an experience with art, and art is part of history. Yes,
an important part of history, and it's infinite. Like you can't put a monetary. I mean, you can put a monetary value on it, but it's generational. It's infinite. We're still going to Dombo Shower to look at rock paintings, like generation after generation. Like it's infinite. Of course, what I think you have added, the piece that you're working on, of course, is like, how do you, at least for a lot of people, it's like, how do you clarify the value? There's a value chain, so we can say, oh, a lot of people, we don't know. Like, just like when you started, you don't know the steps, right? Just like, guys, these are the value chain. This is where you buy. This is how you get involved. What impact do you hope to have with this endeavor, of course, that you're having with championing Zimbabwean artists, bringing Zimbabwean art collectors together? What impact do you hope to have, through this endeavor?
It's twofold, right? So I definitely want for us to have a villa which can house our art collection and bring all sorts of people who are interested in Zimbabwean contemporary arts to experience it in Zimbabwe. So what usually happens in terms of our art, which is well respected internationally, is the moment it's made, it's leaving the continent. So you're kind of having the endemic and so forth. So there's also part of sort of bucking a colonial trend, which is to say our historical artifacts and artworks are all in foreign museums and private collections around the world on one hand. And they are maybe generating value, economic, social, and all sorts for parties like not ourselves. So there's a part of it is to say, I think there's that element. The second element is to say, you're balancing a real estate project with, when you answer with the unique position I have, is also to say, how do we preserve legacy and heritage? So Ishe was my brother's name. So how we came up with the idea was, when I remember the caretaker there says to me, at one point, I say, how did you come to live here? He said, Ishe had a flat tire and I helped him with his tire. Then he said, thank you, you can go and live there. So I thought it was such a beautiful story. I'd never heard of it. So it's also a way of saying, these are small things where you're sort of preserving personal history, but history of a larger story, and trying to put in to say that you need the drivers of art to be local, not just international players. I think that's important.
Phenomenal. And how can people get involved? So of course, or how can I put this? There's a lot of work that's positive that you're doing. How can people get involved? Like tangibly, is it like reach out to X? How can people, where can people start?
Look, so we're still trying to plan out. We're still trying to plan our villa, and we haven't hit the ground yet, but we're hoping to do so by the end of the year. But we have been building our art collection. So if people want to get involved, first and foremost, our priority is to say, art education is important. It's not just for our prospective clients and the like. We have an Instagram page, Ishon Lona. We update it on a regular basis. And we respond to every single question. And we try to share our experiences with those people on that platform. And we answer, I can assure you, we answer every question. And I think, and even there's also a WhatsApp group we've created for people who are more serious about learning. And we've gotten lots of questions, people wanting to say, where do I read? What books can I read? Are there exhibitions of interest wherever I live? How can I empower myself to understand this space? And so we're very, very much accessible in that front, and we kind of hope to continue. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, it is very. We've spoken so much about how you grew up, challenges with secession, contributions you want to make to the art space. And in one of my previous conversations I had on this podcast, there's a lady called Tadzima Dzima, who's the founder of a nonprofit called Ignite Youth. And she always asks the youth that join up her nonprofit to say, in the beginning, first thing, she says, how do you want to be remembered? Which I think is a very important question, at least because for kids who don't know what they want to be when they grow up and they kind of feel a bit lost, it's an important high order thinking question. So to end off this conversation, I want to end off in that way. It's, what is it that you're doing now and how do you want to be remembered? I think that'll of course help us get behind you and kind of follow you on the things that you're kind of working on,
Sure. I think it goes back to what I said earlier. I was always trying to, and I still use that framework, is to say three things: skills, mind, and heart. So my skills, I always wanted to do challenging work, right? Which really pushes the boundaries and forces me to learn new skills. Then intellect, it's always to say, my intellect is to say, yeah, you can do that. But sometimes when you're working for some massive multinational, you're applying only your skills. So you can't maintain intellectual curiosity and creativity and in the way that I need to be fulfilled. And then the third thing is my heart, is to say, I hope that people will feel that the reason I was approaching or doing certain things was to say, that's how I can have the most impact personally and professionally. So I think it's just very simple to me, is to say, okay, she used the skills she was responsible with her education, she was responsible with any privilege she had, and that she created more opportunities for others, and wasn't afraid to have a conviction and to disagree and to push the boundaries, so to speak.
And that whilst doing that, she used her heart too, which is everything.
It's something for women, right? So you're always struggling with that, because when I came back, I remember I could be reduced to tears. I remember I went to some magistrate courts and I burst into tears because I didn't know what I was doing. There's no way you could have told me that I can handle a plant, right? At all. There's no way you could have told me, my younger self. But there's no way you could have told me that I would be willing to disagree and to, engage in strategic litigation if I feel that there's a governance issue that hasn't been attended to correctly. There's no way you would have told me that I wouldn't be, shaken by any of, this kind of work. You're formalizing an enterprise, so you are inherently consistently in some level of conflict, which usually ends up in court. There's no way you would have told younger Ropa that I would be leading the charge and saying, this is one of my work and I've just come to accept it, because I kind of would have cowered at confrontation, because I would have presumed that I would have kept my opinions to myself, because you don't offend someone for having a differing opinion, right? And you would have thought being offensive means that you're being unkind, whereas that's not quite the case, right? It's to say, at times you just have to make progress, and that hard part is to say, okay, am I doing this with convictions, and to understand that this is fair to a range of stakeholders who may not be in this room. You get what I mean? So am I having this confrontation with relative X to say, hey, you can't just come to work without a contract and bully people? You get what I mean? If I'm saying, Uncle Thing, your time has come to an end, and he's saying, yeah, you're offensive. But then I look at it to say, Uncle X is being unfair to all the hardworking people. He's expecting to be paid 10 times his salary, but do a 10th of the work. And that's not fair to other staff. So my point is, I've offended Uncle X, but maybe there's other, you get the point. So it's now something where I also am comfortable with not being everyone's cup of tea.
That's a question. No, it's first because I often feel like I'm a recovering people pleaser. Yeah. And there's always a line you want to always know, but it's fine, let's make everybody happy. But sometimes you're like, no, that's not going to make you happy. And
that's how you lose progress to me. You get my point. And I can see that for me, I struggled because I'd never, when you now become a leader, you always have to say, maybe my position will be judged in 10 years when the next generation comes. So I'm not trying to have the enemies of progress who are in this room right now. If I appease them, I'm destroying the next generation or the people that are coming after me. So it's a part where I've kind of understood, and this is also I've also understood that it's also gendered, that women who have a bit of power or success or who are in jobs that women just don't do, right? So, like these entrepreneurial things or in in sectors that are just not friendly, that you're not doing it for a popularity contest. You're actually doing it so that you can say, look, maybe at this stage with this audience, they may not get it, but maybe in 10 years, the people coming after would say that woman was ahead of her time.
And so you are. Ropa, thank you for the time. I appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation.
Chaga uripiko, baby, baby, wacho nani? Akuyewezane iko, ona mangwa nani? Oga, andino muka, lobu chaga uripiko, baby, baby, wacho nani? Akuyewezane iko, I find myself time traveling down the road, back to a time when we were strangers and apart. I had never met anyone like you, and I must confess that I had never been so jealous to feel the stress. I am so taken by you, oh baby, I'm so taken by you. Hey, mangwanani, oga, handino muka, nokuchaga uripiko, baby, baby, wacho nani? Akuyewezane iko, ona mangwa nani? Oga, andino muka, nokuchaga uripiko, baby, baby, wacho nani? Akuyewezane iko, I'm so taken by you, baby, I'm so taken by you, honey, I'm so taken by you. Hey lover, I'm so taken by you. Hey, yo, envision us taking a stroll, me holding your hand, we having a chat. I'm hoping that we go out again, you seem surprised. I can see by the look in your eyes. I said let's talk about it, you say you have to decide. You've been through many men, some of them you rather forget. Conscious bottles of love that left you rather upset, and now you're crying. I never made to see you shed a tear. Always brought around, it's funny, notice that I care when I'm willing to be there, what to do, giving my all when I do, catch you when you fall. Girl, I love you, you're my African queen, the only one I see in my sweet African dreams. Mangwanani, oga, searching, mandino muka, nokuchaga uripiko, baby, wacho nani? searching mangwanani. Oh God, searching, searching pandinobuka. Nokutaga uripiko. Baby, baby, watoro nani. Akwelezane iko. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Every morning, 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 mamba kweza. Pandinomuka. Yeah, ekseni.